October 29, 1942. The Mid-Atlantic Gap. A region beyond the reach of Allied air cover where the North Atlantic provides no mercy. The SS Stephen Hopkins, a Liberty ship, traverses a Force 5C. She is an emergency response to a logistical crisis, a mass-produced hull capable of just 11 knots. Below deck, her triple expansion engine rhythmically pulses, pushing a wall of water that she was never intended to outrun. On the stern, Merchant Marine gunner Paul Buck stands beside a heavy relic of a previous era. This is the 4-inch/50 caliber Mark 9 gun. It was designed in 1910, an age of dreadnoughts and coal-fired boilers. The air here is a thick slurry of salt spray, wet soot from the stack, and the heavy, cloying scent of low-grade bunker fuel. The steel beneath Buck's boots is just 0.75 inches thick, unhardened mild steel, not ballistic armor plate. In any clinical assessment of modern naval warfare, the Hopkins is a non-combatant. Statistically, her probability of surviving a sustained surface engagement with a dedicated Kriegsmarine cruiser or a hostile U-boat wolf pack stands at exactly 0%. She is a floating warehouse, 13,000 tons of displacement with the defensive structural integrity of a discarded tin can. In the cold mathematics of the Atlantic tonnage war, she is not a ship, she is a target waiting for a torpedo to find its mark. But the Germans didn't account for the 1910 hardware, or the man who knew its specific tolerances perfectly. The year 1942 represented a period of sustained logistical hemorrhage for the Allied forces. The Atlantic Ocean had ceased to be a mere transit route, and had transformed into a graveyard of industrial output. The numbers were catastrophic. Monthly losses were peaking at 600,000 tons of vital shipping, creating a deficit that the American shipyards were struggling to bridge through mass production. This was the era of desperation mathematics. For every new Liberty ship launched from the ways in Richmond or South Portland, 2 more were frequently sent to the seabed by the relentless efficiency of the Kriegsmarine's submarine fleet. It was a war of attrition where the calculus of victory favored the hunter. U-boat commanders, observing these sluggish vessels through their Zeiss optics, referred to them derisively as gray diplomats. The nickname was earned because the ships were essentially defenseless, often offering no resistance as they were systematically dismantled by deck guns or torpedoes. To the German naval elite, a merchant ship was not a combatant, it was a unit of arithmetic, a simple tonnage value to be subtracted from the Allied ledger to induce strategic starvation. Despite this vulnerability, a forgotten archive reveals a period of intense internal debate within the Admiralty. Naval planners initially refused to allocate modern weaponry to the merchant marine, arguing that mounting a functional cannon on a slow-moving cargo hull was a fundamental waste of a good gun. They believed that hardware should be reserved for warships capable of tactical movement, leaving the Liberty ships to rely solely on the statistical safety of the convoy. This tactical isolation made her an ideal candidate for an opportunistic strike by any marauding submersible that happened to intersect her plotted course. The Atlantic was massive, yet the intersections of commerce and combat were becoming increasingly frequent and violent. For the men aboard the Hopkins, their only defense lay in the hope that their low profile and unremarkable silhouette would keep them invisible to the predator. To the Kriegsmarine, she was a slow-moving target. To the engineers in the hold, she was a 14,000-ton lure. The technical heart of the SS Stephen Hopkins was her 3-cylinder, triple-expansion steam engine. In an era where high-performance naval vessels utilized sophisticated steam turbines, the Liberty ship relied on a reciprocating design that was fundamentally archaic. This choice was not made for efficiency, but for manufacturability. These engines were massive, heavy, and operated at a sluggish 76 revolutions per minute. However, this mechanical obsolescence provided an unintended ballistic advantage. Unlike the high-frequency vibrations of a turbine-driven destroyer, which can blur optical sights and introduce jitter into fire control instruments, the Hopkins possessed a low-frequency harmonic pulse. The rhythmic movement of the massive pistons functioned as a form of mechanical dither. This constant, predictable vibration kept the manual gears of the gun mount in a state of kinetic readiness, preventing the stiction that often plagued manual traverse systems during fine adjustments. The primary armament was the 4-inch Mark IX gun, a weapon that preceded the advent of centralized fire control. It featured a simple pedestal mount with manual handwheels for elevation and deflection. There was no radar interface and no automated lead computing compensator. The gunner relied entirely on a telescopic sight and an ingrained understanding of ballistic arcs. To calculate the environmental variables, the crew employed a rudimentary but effective observation technique involving the ship's exhaust. By monitoring the drift and dissipation of the thick soot cloud emerging from the single funnel, the gunner could visually estimate the wind shear at sea level. This particulate matter provided a real-time data stream regarding crosswind velocity and air density, allowing the gunner to apply manual corrections to the deflection gear. This was the engineering paradox of the Atlantic War. A modern destroyer was built for speed, but its narrow beam and high center of gravity made it a violent, unstable platform in heavy swells. Conversely, the Liberty ship was a 14,000-ton block of displacement, sitting deep in the water. Her mass provided incredible longitudinal stability, and her slow speed reduced the turbulent wake that could interfere with depth perception across the waves. This stability allowed the obsolete Mark IX gun to be operated with the precision of a bench-rested rifle. While a U-boat commander struggled with the chaotic pitch and roll of a small, buoyant hull, the gunners on the Hopkins occupied a platform that refused to be hurried or shaken. It was an industrial-scale laboratory of physics where the lack of speed was the primary variable in achieving accuracy. In the calculated exchange of fire that was about to occur, the technological disparity would be countered by the cold reality of mass and momentum. The triple expansion engine functioned with a steady breathing, its high-pressure cylinder exhausting into the intermediate and low-pressure chambers. This sequential expansion created a unique metronome. By timing their trigger pulls to the peak of the engine's power stroke, they synchronized their actions with the ship's soul. This was mechanical synergy at most fundamental, unyielding, and lethal level. The predator was faster, but the prey was a steady laboratory. AT-935, the contact transition from a subsurface acoustic signature to a visual reality. The U-boat breached the surface at a distance of approximately 1,000 yards. It was a Type IXC, a long-range ocean cruiser designed for the specific purpose of interdicting Allied commerce. With a surface speed of 19 knots, the submarine possessed nearly double the velocity of the Hopkins. Its 105mm deck gun was manned within seconds. To the German commander, the engagement was a formality. He possessed a weapon with superior muzzle velocity and a fire control system calibrated by the finest optical engineers at Zeiss. Through the high-definition lenses, the Liberty ship appeared as an unmoving wall of iron. On the stern of the Hopkins, Paul Buck and his crew did not have the luxury of precision ground glass. They relied on a primary telescopic sight and a secondary system consisting of grease pencil marks on a fixed glass pane, used to establish lead and elevation based on the ship's own speed. The discrepancy in technology was absolute. One side looked through the pinnacle of 1940s optics. The other looked through hand-drawn lines on a piece of transparency. The gunners on the Hopkins initiated the firing sequence. The loader slammed a 40-pound shell into the open breech of the Mark IX. The mechanical clack-thud of the breech block locking into place echoed against the steel deckhouse. When the trigger was pulled, the recoil was violent. The 1910 design mount was being subjected to pressures at the extreme edge of its structural envelope. Beneath the barrel, the hydraulic recoil cylinders, aged by decades of storage and sea salt, began to weep fluid. Microscopic fissures in the seals, pressurized by the sudden rearward momentum, forced atomized oil into the air. The U-boat's first shell arrived with a high-velocity crack, detonating in the water just 20 yards off the port beam. The Hopkins hull groaned as the shockwave compressed the air-filled spaces of the cargo holds. Mild steel plates shifted against their rivets, a sound like a hammer striking a cathedral bell. The ship shuddered not from an engine pulse, but from the physical weight of the near-miss displacement. The German crew began to correct their aim for a direct hit on the engine room. Buck ignored the spray and the shrapnel. He was calculating the rate of closure. Every second, the distance decreased, changing the ballistic trajectory. He adjusted the handwheels, feeling the resistance in the gears. The metal-on-metal interface was the only feedback he required. He was not aiming at a ship, he was aiming at a mathematical coordinate in the Atlantic mist. His focus remained on the intersection of trajectory and hull. He accounted for the ship's roll, the swell of the Atlantic, and the aging tolerances of the Mark IX. The German gunners relied on their advanced equipment to compensate for the sea state, but Buck relied on his own internal timing. The Germans fired for pure psychological effect. The Americans fired for the absolute certainty of physics. By the 10th minute of the engagement, the SS Stephen Hopkins was structurally compromised. High explosive shells from the German 105 mm gun had perforated the midships casing, and a direct hit near the waterline had initiated a steady ingress of seawater into the engine room. The reciprocating pistons continued to churn, but the air was thick with atomized steam and the smell of burning lubricant. The engineering staff worked in a rising tide of oily bilge water, maintaining manifold pressure while the hull vibrated under the impact of near misses. On the stern, the situation was equally critical. Shrapnel had shredded the canvas awnings and pockmarked the gun tub. Yet, the Mark IX mount remained functional. Paul Buck observed the U-boat through the heat haze of the burning deck. The German commander, emboldened by his perceived superiority, had closed the distance to less than 800 yards. As the submarine crested a massive Atlantic swell, its entire forward section emerged from the water, exposing the saddle tanks and the lower curve of the pressure hull. This was a vulnerability dictated by fluid dynamics. For a fraction of a second at the apex of the swell, the U-boat's most vital engineering components were vulnerable to a horizontal trajectory. Buck adjusted his lead. He was no longer using the sights for a centermass shot. He was timing the interval of the ocean. He calculated the periodicity of the waves, a consistent 7-second cycle. He needed to synchronize the firing pin with the trough of the wave when the Hopkins stern was at its lowest, most stable point, and the U-boat was at its highest exposure. He leveraged the 14,000-ton inertia of the cargo ship as a mechanical dampener. While the lighter submarine was tossed by the sea, the Liberty ship's sheer mass resisted the vertical oscillation, providing a 3-second window of relative atmospheric stability. The gunner ignored the fires and the screams of tearing metal. His hands remained steady on the traverse wheels, compensating for the ship's slow yaw. He waited for the specific moment when the horizon line aligned with his grease pencil mark. The loader shoved a final, high-explosive round into the smoking chamber. The breech closed with a metallic finality. Buck pulled the trigger at the exact moment the ship reached the bottom of the swell. The recoil overstressed the mounting bolts, shearing 2 of them instantly, but the shell was already in flight. It traversed the 800 yards in a flat, high-velocity arc. The 1910-era projectile, a design considered obsolete by every naval academy in Europe, struck the German Type IXC exactly at the waterline. The impact was a study in kinetic transfer. The shell pierced the outer ballast tank and detonated against the pressurized steel of the inner hull. The structural integrity of the submarine, designed to withstand the crushing depths of the Atlantic, was compromised by a weapon from the age of steam. The resulting breach was catastrophic. High-pressure air escaped in a violent geyser as the sea rushed into the electrical compartments. The sophisticated Predator began to lose buoyancy, its bow dipping into the gray water at an uncontrollable angle. The slow ship had just delivered a fatal blow to a machine that outclassed it by 30 years. This success was not luck, but the inevitable outcome of a stable platform meeting a vulnerable target. Every mechanical calculation made in battle had yielded its intended result. The Atlantic had claimed a victim, but this time the math had reversed the expected order of maritime survival. No amount of German engineering could compensate for that single, perfect impact. The sinking of the U-boat provided no immediate reprieve for the SS Stephen Hopkins. Victory was a secondary concern to the immediate, escalating failure of the ship's primary systems. The vessel had sustained over 30 direct hits from the German deck gun. Its structural integrity was now a matter of desperate calculation. The hull had developed a sustained 12-degree list to the starboard side, a lean that complicated every mechanical operation on board. In the engine room, the situation had transitioned from a tactical crisis to an industrial catastrophe. The stokers and engineers were operating in waist-deep water, a mixture of seawater and lubricating oil that sloshed with the ship's roll, threatening to extinguish the furnace fires. Maintaining steam pressure became the crew's singular objective. Without pressure, the pumps would cease to function, and the battle against hydrostatic ingress would be lost instantly. This was the math of endurance. Every pound per square inch of manifold steam pressure was a measure of time remaining above the surface. The engineers struggled with the feed water system, as the list made it increasingly difficult to maintain the proper water levels in the boilers. If the water dropped too low, the boiler tubes would overheat and rupture. If it rose too high, liquid water would carry over into the cylinders, causing a catastrophic hydraulic lock that would shatter the engine's reciprocating mass. Despite their efforts, the rate of flooding eventually overtaxed the capacity of the bilge pumps. The mild steel of the bulkheads, weakened by shelf fire and thermal stress, began to buckle. The order to abandon ship was not a choice but a technical necessity. As the Hopkins began her final descent into the Atlantic, the survivors faced a new set of lethal variables. The survival ratio was grim. 19 men climbed into a single lifeboat that had been designed to accommodate a maximum of 15. This overage increased the boat's displacement, reducing its freeboard to a matter of inches in a predatory ocean. They were over 1,000 miles from the nearest land, located in a region of the Atlantic where the currents were unpredictable and the weather was deteriorating. The lifeboat was not just a vessel, it was a closed system with finite resources, limited water, limited rations, and the limited caloric output of 19 exhausted men. They were no longer fighting a human enemy. They were navigating the cold mathematics of buoyancy and thermal regulation. Every ounce of weight had to be balanced. Every single movement had to be calculated to prevent a capsizing event that none would survive. The fight for the Hopkins had concluded in a tactical draw, leaving both combatants at the bottom of the sea. But for the survivors, the trial of endurance was just beginning. The transition from the deck of a massive warship to the tight confines of a wooden boat shifted the fundamental nature of their survival. Winning the fight was a matter of terminal ballistics. Getting home was a matter of thermodynamics. The Stephen Hopkins holds a singular place in maritime history. She remains the only American merchant vessel to sink a German surface combatant during a direct surface engagement. The final tally was absolute: 1 Liberty ship lost, 1 Type IXC U-boat destroyed. This was not a victory of superior technology, but a victory of mechanical reliability and human composure. Throughout the 30-minute engagement, the 1910 design 4-inch Mark 9 gun fired 35 rounds. Despite its age and the extreme pressures placed on its recoil system, it did not suffer a single mechanical failure or jam. The unrefined machinery of the emergency fleet had proven more resilient than the high-tolerance systems of the Kriegsmarine. Today, the hull of the Hopkins rests on the ocean floor, a permanent monument to the industrial effort that defined the era. The legacy of the engagement extends beyond the ship itself to the citizen sailors who manned it. Men who were not career naval officers, but technicians and laborers who applied the logic of their trades to combat. This specific engagement forced the German High Command to reevaluate their entire surface attack doctrine. The realization that a lone, slow-moving cargo ship could lethally engage a surface U-boat led to an immediate shift in tactics. German commanders were ordered to avoid surface gun duels with armed merchantmen, fearing the stability and persistence of these unlikely platforms more than the speed of a destroyer. This shift in doctrine effectively validated the concept of the armed freighter as a strategic deterrent. It proved that in a conflict of attrition, even the most overlooked hardware can become a decisive factor when operated with absolute precision. This is the cold, immutable reality of the massive maritime sea. In the mathematics of total war, never mistake a low velocity for a low impact.